Without further ado, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you find yourself. I'm Jake Newton with Center for Personal Protection and Safety. I'm the Vice President of Security Solutions for the company. I'll be moderating today's panel and discussion, talking about active assailant preparedness and the overall workshop. I've been in this industry overall for 14 years, started off in the Air Force, and now with the company, I basically manage ops. I'm going to lay some groundwork and some admin items for the time we have together, and then I'll pass it around for introductions as well, so you can get to know everybody. But before we get rolling, I know some of you received an inaccurate time frame for this time together, and we want to sincerely apologize for the confusion with that. We switched this at one point from a meeting to a webinar, and the time zone didn't accurately get updated a little bit for a few of you. So if that happened to you, we sincerely apologize. You will be getting the recording to this if you didn't have the opportunity to join live, so you'll be seeing this afterwards. But thank you for your patience with us. We know it's really frustrating when that occurs. So again, we apologize for that. But this is going to be a 2-hour session. We may not use the whole time depending, but we wanted to use this time frame to discuss some current trends and some themes as it relates to active assailant preparedness, and really use this as an opportunity for everybody to ask questions and talk about some of the challenges that you're actually experiencing in your day-to-day. And so as you have questions throughout this time frame, I'm sure everybody is familiar with how we do webinars nowadays. But if you want to submit a question through the Q&A as per usual, feel free to do that. You can submit your question and type it in. But we also want to provide the opportunity for individuals to submit questions or ask questions live as well. That portion will be for the second half of this time together. So if that's something you're interested in doing, in the Q&A box, just simply submit a question mark. And then when that time comes, I'll set the permissions where you can come on and talk about the nuances and the context and ask your question at that time. And then we'll address those considerations live. Otherwise, this is going to be a live time frame where we're talking through some of these different considerations, overall program development, how you build your protocols. We want to talk about the slow walk concept, which is probably going to be new for most all of you, if not everybody, and really diving into some of these different things like the options-based approach. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Stacy to introduce herself first, and then we'll go Dave, and then we'll go Randy for Randy to actually kick off the workshop. So Stacy, to you first.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you everyone for joining us. We are excited for this opportunity and looking forward to sharing some information with you all. So I'm Stacy Brown. I'm the Manager of Security Solutions here at CPPS. I've been with CPPS for about 1.5 years now, teaching this to corporations and so on and so forth. Before that, I spent 12 years at the United States Air Force Survival School, working for the Department of Defense, teaching this to, or teaching high-risk training to those going into high-risk situations. And kind of what I saw towards the last bit of that is that the times were kind of changing, and it's like the military has their resources, but what about everybody else? So it's a real honor and privilege to be here today discussing this all with you all. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. Hi, everybody. Dave Benson. I'm the Senior Advisor for Global Operations and Threat Mitigation for CPPS. I know we have some familiar faces on the webinar, but for those I haven't met, let me just briefly tell you what I'm responsible for at the center, and then a little bit of my background. So I started with the Walt Disney Company over 40 years ago. Spent 8.5 years there in Orlando, Florida, which is where I'm broadcasting from now, doing a myriad of things, operations, investigations, physical security, protection, those types of things, followed by just under 24 years with the U.S. Department of State Diplomatic Security Service. For those folks that may not be that familiar with DSS, we're the security and law enforcement arm of the foreign affairs community. In the course of my career, I spent about half my time overseas in such places as Egypt, Sri Lanka, Finland, and Bangladesh during the 9/11 period. Was also very fortunate to be part of the master planning for the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. Since I've met Randy, we're going on probably about 14 years now plus. Time flies when you're having fun. In addition to doing training, I also am responsible for managing the assessment threat mitigation program that some of you have partaken in. And then also the real-time threat assessment and management and behavioral threat assessment and management training. Randy, back over to you.
Thank you, Dave and Jake and Stacy, and good day, everybody. I appreciate you taking some time to spend with us to kind of take a deeper dive into this area of active shooter, active assailant, active threat, whatever it is you want to call it. But I think we're going to cover some areas that will go a little bit of a deeper dive on how to operationalize your program and make it applicable for your organization, possibly even more so than you have it right now. My background, for those of you that I've not met, and I do recognize some of the names over here and who's online, but I was in the Air Force, and in that capacity, I was an intelligence officer coming out of the Air Force Academy for college, and I landed here in Spokane, Washington, which is where the Air Force, as you heard from Jake and Stacy, has their Air Force Survival School. And I was aligned with a program that was called the High Risk Survival Programs. And so the groups, not just in the Air Force, but the entire Department of Defense, that the military in the United States had designated as the highest risk of finding themselves in either a kidnap situation, a hostage situation, or a government detention. We would be training them on how to survive that and how to minimize being exploited in those kind of high risk scenarios. And I did that for a number of years. And then, and by the way, isn't it interesting that, this was back in the 90s when we were doing this, you see full circle coming back around with hostage taking, government detention, coming back up on the radar, maybe a little more so than we have seen in the last decade or two. But I then worked into the policy and oversight for the U.S. military, working with our allied countries to help standardize those training programs between our allies and the United States, and developing policies that were consistent, so that one of the problems we had in Desert Storm was we had U.S. military and Australian and UK military service members that had different sets of guidance, and it caused a lot of problems when they were being held in Iraq. So I did that, and then started the company 21 years ago. And we focused in on high-risk survival, particularly kidnap survival. We were branded as the National Hostage Survival Training Center for a few years. Shortly realized that was way too scary for most of corporate America, and so we rebranded into the Safe Travel Institute. And then in 2007, when the Virginia Tech shooting happened, realized that there was all this training that we had for training people on dealing with a hostage barricade or kidnap survival, but for a scenario like Virginia Tech, an active shooter, there was no guidance out there. And so when I saw the after action reports from Virginia Tech and saw that the shooter, he walked into one of the classrooms and shot a couple of the students, and then walked down the hallway for a couple of minutes and came back. We knew from the work we had done in the military that a typical reaction to that kind of a horrific situation, if you haven't had training, is to be startled, afraid, and then either freeze or just react. Well, in this case, those students were sitting on the floor holding on to each other. The shooter, he walks around and kills 6 more. And so when I saw that, I thought to myself, man, if we can create training for real high-risk people in the military, we ought to be able to create something to address this type of a scenario and give people options on how to respond. And that's what we did. We put together folks from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, the senior hostage negotiator for the FBI, and some high-risk trainers from the military, and put together the first guidance in the country on how to respond to an active shooter situation, which was a video called Shots Fired back in 2007. And because that was the first guidance that was put out, it really opened up the folks that we would work with, whether it's in government and education sector, corporations, all were looking for some type of solution. And it wasn't really easy, to be honest with you. It wasn't easy to sit down and figure out, okay, if you're going to do this in a hostage situation, how would it be different in an active shooter situation? Excuse me. And be able to put out something that, number one, was easy to understand, but also didn't get those that are using that guidance sued, and you can imagine the challenges of corporate security folks walking into their legal department and trying to get buy-in to do active shooter training in 2007. And I'm going to talk about the history in just a moment, but that's what led us into the field that we're in right now, and why we still do some of the survival training and travel safety, travel risk management. By far, the majority is in the area as Dave mentioned, on threat assessment, threat awareness, violence prevention, and the programmatics that we're going to talk about today. How do you build resiliency within your organization by building resiliency within the individuals within your organization? So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about. But that's how we got into this business, and we've been working in this field now. We just celebrated our 21st anniversary a couple of weeks ago. So looking forward to spending the time with you. So I think I'm going to kick it off by talking a little bit historically about active shooter. And how did we get to where we're at right now? I gave a little bit that in the introduction, but active shooter and active assailant's not a new thing. If you go back to 1966, University of Texas in Austin had the Texas Tower shooting. It was an ex-Marine that shot up the campus and killed 17 people. So it's been there for decades, but not at the level anywhere near, obviously, that we're at right now and what we've seen. And if you kind of go back to historically, I was looking back, when was the postal shootings? So you had a number of shootings taking place every couple of years, but then in 1986 to about 1997, there was a series of about 7 active shooter incidents, including one in Oklahoma in 1986 that killed 14 people. And so if you've been around a while, you might remember the term, quote unquote, going postal. Well, that came from a series of workplace violence incidents and active shooter situations being in the government offices, and in that case, post offices. And then, so every year you'd see some of these happening, but then in 1999, you had Columbine. And it's interesting, whenever I speak on this, I'll say, isn't it interesting how you can just say certain words and you exactly know what we're talking about? Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Uvalde. Who knew where Uvalde was? Nobody. But they're scenes of these horrific incidents. And so you had 12 students killed in Columbine, and most people remember that was where some of the law enforcement strategies and the after action changed, from surround the school or the building and calling SWAT teams to the now rapid response teams, and whoever's first on scene, goes in to try and stop the violence. And then there's occasional shootings through the early 2000s, but then the Virginia Tech shooting that I mentioned in 2007. And this is where things really started to pick up in the pace, particularly as we moved into the mid 2015 and on. So Virginia Tech, 32 people killed in that incident. Some of the takeaways from the Virginia Tech shooting had to do with mental health issues and mental health privacy and HIPAA Act, and what can counselors say and not say without violating HIPAA. Another big one had to do with emergency notification systems on campus, and because if you recall, there was actually 2 shootings that day. One was in a dormitory, and then the notifications didn't go out very well to the campus, and then the really bad one in the hall where most of the fatalities took place. So there were several takeaways that happened, and that's also when, as I mentioned earlier, we began to get into creating and distributing, active shooter training. And before 2007, it just didn't exist. So it was late 2007 when we published that video called Shots Fired. And one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, well, how did you create a program that would be widely used, even without scaring people? Because if you look at some of the programs that are out there, it's kind of graphic. Some of the programs that look like a Quentin Tarantino movie in certain parts of it, because it got blood splattered on glass, and we knew that wasn't going to sell. It wasn't going to be not just sell, it wasn't going to be implemented. It wasn't going to get the buy-in by the leadership of the organization if it's too sensationalistic. At the same time, you have to get enough content where it actually is worthwhile. And so one of the keys that we've seen over the years to getting buy-in and not getting sued is that in the training for active shooter is you don't tell people they should do anything. And I've seen well-meaning instructors that go out there and somewhere in there they put their opinion into how should people respond, or you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, and essentially how we were able to create the content that was then picked up by the FBI and DHS and other groups was to say, from the time violence begins until the first responders arrive, the people that are your students or your family members or your employees, they're in what we call that extreme danger gap. And they have to choose. They have to know what their options are. And we'll talk more about that options-based response. But that's what really began the catalyst for Virginia Tech to the training and policy and guidance being distributed within the country came out in that 2007 to 2009 timeframe. And finally, Department of Homeland Security put out, national policy, and that's where you saw some of the run, hike, fight vernacular come through. And then, as we moved into the next decade, you go from Virginia Tech to Sandy Hook in 2012. One of the key things with the Sandy Hook shooting was, you'd seen these incidents happening, post offices, corporations, government agencies, high schools and colleges, but not down into an elementary school, not 5 and 6 year olds. That was just on a whole nother level. And, it kind of like broke through a barrier. And I think it's, fair to say, and I'm sure this is why a number of you are online right now, is there are no real safe havens in places even, historically, you would think would be safe, like a house of worship. The 5th worst shooting in the United States history happened in a church down in San Antonio, or outside of San Antonio, Texas. That was number 5. So you would think that would be insulated and immune for some of these kind of violent incidents, but it's just not the case. So then starting really about 2016 with the shooting at the Pulse nightclub down in Orlando, Florida, near Dave's, where he's at, to then the Las Vegas shooting the year in 2017. That shooting at the church was in 2017. Parkland school shooting is in 2018. The Walmart El Paso shooting, 2019, and even to just a couple of weeks ago in Lewiston, Maine, a pretty sleepy, mellow area, not known for high crime. You have the 10th most significant. When I say significant, just the number of people. It's not a head count or a body count, but it's, it does identify the patterns. And the patterns is we've been seeing the numbers of these shootings increase in frequency, and they're becoming more people dying and getting injured. And you can see it as you look through the timelines. And so it's not going away. And unfortunately, we were just talking about this as a team a couple of days ago. The threat profile is not going away. There's more amplified concerns and angst in our country and around the world. I mean, there's a global travel alert right now for any American traveling anywhere, put out by the State Department. And so I think that you're not going to see this issue go away anytime soon. There's a lot of dynamics, and it gets politicized, whether it's pro-gun or totally anti-gun. One of the things we know and have learned over the years is that to get buy-in on these programs, it really, the gun issue is not something we focus on. What we're really focused on is building resiliency and understanding how people can prevent it through behavioral understanding of behavioral indicators, become stakeholders in their own safety by being engaged in the program itself, and then knowing what their options are if the things hit the fan, worst case scenario. And having done this now for 21 years, particularly in the area of active assailant since 2007, one of the things that I've noticed, and then I'll turn it back over to Jake and Stacy. One of the things that I've noticed is that when this training is done properly, and it's not just an isolated, you're not just doing active shooter training, but it's part of a holistic program on violence prevention and threat awareness and different levels of understanding from your employees to your managers to your leadership. When it's done properly, not only does it build resiliency within the organization, but the employees, we've seen it time and time again, where they come back to the leaders of the organization saying, thank you so much for caring enough about us to take the time and the resources to train and equip us, not just on how we would respond, but how we can go back to our families and educate them and talk to the families, my kids and my spouses, significant others, because they don't know what to do. Even in most of the schools right now, they're doing more, but it's still a lot of it's lockdown drills. And so it's our family members that are at church on Sunday or in the mall or a restaurant, and we're just seeing these things happen everywhere. So it's more of a societal issue is my point. This isn't really just a workplace issue. This is sadly, it's just a reality of our environment. And so to provide people with solutions that are easy to understand, that don't scare them, but empower and equip them, they come back and say, thank you. and then they become stakeholders, not just for themselves, but for their loved ones. And you know, that's really the power of providing this program to your folks. And like I said, I've seen time and time again, and if ever it's needed, and de-escalation skills are ever needed, it's right now. So Jake or Stacy, I'll turn it back over to you now after kind of providing that as a little bit of historical background.
Yeah, well, I appreciate what you said there, Randy, and I don't think we can overemphasize the theme, I think, of largely what you were saying in terms of the power of an empowered individual, just like what you said, becoming a stakeholder in their individual safety and security. It's one part of this, but it is such a huge part of this. And that really relates to the training aspects of this and walking individuals through what does that look like and how can they become a stakeholder in their safety and security and have that ownership, and what does that look like? And so, Stace, I think the question to you is, can you talk us through that? What does it mean to train the individual, and how important is that? And what does that mean in context of active assailant response?
Yeah, thank you, Jake and Randy. Yeah, so training the individual for active assailant response, it's valuable for several different reasons, and that's what we're going to discuss in just a moment here. So really, through the training, what you're doing is you're attempting to generate this automatic response in these individuals. So this is what we know. In high stress situations, individuals may experience this heightened adrenaline level and this cognitive overload, which makes it challenging to really think clearly should they find themselves in one of these situations. So creating this muscle memory, it enables these individuals to react automatically and instinctively without relying solely on that conscious thought. So let me give you a quick example of a training I did. I did this training, active assailant training, in an auditorium at a conference to a group that really hadn't received any type of active assailant training or run, hide, fight training. And so after introducing the topic and then telling them how they become the immediate responders in this type of situation, they kind of shook their head in agreement, signifying that they would know what to do, until I proceeded to introduce a scenario where I became the active assailant in the room. And I told them, okay, I'm the active assailant and I just fired a first round. Then when I asked them what they would do, they kind of looked at me with these big eyes. Then they looked at each other. Then they looked back at me like, okay, what do we do? What's the answer? And I'm like, well, I'm the active assailant. Are you guys really looking at me in this situation? But really, this is ironically, this is a typical response in real life situations for individuals that haven't been trained. So another example is I just spent 3 weeks working with leaders of an organization, conducting this type of training in person versus what they've already received through these e-learning venues, right? So they had some type of general awareness type training. So I did the same exact scenario for them. This time in these situations, they were able to recall the words run, hide, fight, right? Which is good in this situation until I said, okay, go. Then they looked at me with these big eyes. They looked at each other. They looked back at me and they started giving me some options. They said, okay, we'll run. And I said, okay, well, where are you running to? And they're looking around and we have all these doors surrounding us and all these different options, but they're like, and they kind of pick one and they go with it. Maybe one or two in these situations would actually say fight. And usually it was the individuals that were furthest from me in these situations. And then of course you had a handful that would say hide. And sometimes those were the individuals that were closest to me in this scenario. And so they could recall the response options, but they really didn't have that muscle memory built in to take action in these situations. So this can be critical in these rapidly evolving and dangerous situations. So doing this training for the individual, it aids in speed, it aids in efficiency, in allowing them the opportunity to recall the information and then respond immediately, not missing these precious moments to get away from danger. So this is incredibly important. So that muscle memory is that critical piece. So one real life example I'll give you is this lady went through active assailant training where they talked through the various options. Then as time lapses and goes by, she had this training at work. And so she found herself at a grocery store. So she was in the produce section and she heard what sounds like a shot fired. Well, again, she looks around in this situation and everybody's looking around at each other kind of frozen. and they're trying to figure out what to do. Well, she recalls her training quickly, and that training was believe what you see and hear. So as others in that situation were trying to rationalize what it is that they were hearing, maybe it was fireworks, or maybe it was a door slamming, or maybe pallets in the room were dropping on the floor. And so she quickly recalled that believe what you see and hear, and took action. So these shots sounded like they were coming from the front end of the store. So she quickly proceeded to the back of the store, out through receiving. Well, what she found in responding this way was there were several individuals in tow. And then pretty soon she kind of becomes the leader in this situation. And so she's like, okay, guys, let's go out this way, and kind of takes a lower position. She sees people down aisles as she's on her way out of the store, kind of frozen with that same reaction, and said, come on, kind of ushered them towards her and got them all out back through that receiving deck and out to safety in that situation. So that's the type of training we're talking about. It's creating that muscle memory. And she was surprised in that situation that she had that reaction and kind of became the leader as the situation was kind of unfolding. And so the military actually has a term for this. It's called action paralysis. And so there's a reason why we see, our SEAL teams spending 90-something% of their time training. It's because it's easy to say, okay, when you're downrange and you're experiencing this fear, this anxiety, do X, Y, Z until you're downrange, standing in the barrel of the enemy's weapon. And now what you're doing is this action paralysis. Well, these trained teams recall this training, they recall this muscle memory, and then they act accordingly. So this is why individual training is so important, because also what it can do is it can break these prior habits that maybe we didn't even know, or we were aware that we would react in certain situations. For example, growing up in Southern California, we had these earthquake drills all the time. So as soon as I found myself in emergency situations, as I kind of went out through the world, anytime it was an emergency, it was like, oh, I duck and cover, get under a desk, right? Not ideal in these situations to get under an open desk if you're faced with an active assailant situation. So sometimes we realize a lot about ourselves as we kind of go through this scenario-based training and create this muscle memory for ourselves as well. It also aids in this consistency and execution. So consistency is key in emergency situations. It reduces the likelihood of this hesitation during a crisis and hesitating to respond. What we're also seeing is it increases the confidence as well. So as you kind of go through this training, these exercises, you see this change in individuals from the beginning of the exercise to the end. And so it always seems to be this confidence course, whether we mean for it to be or not. But you see these individuals kind of transform as they go through this training. So sometimes people feel in these situations, or as Randy mentioned, it's now this societal problem, and they kind of feel like there's nothing they can do. But once they realize there's a lot that they can do, and there's a lot of considerations that they can make, you see this increase their confidence, and they almost feel this sense, not almost, they do feel this sense of empowerment once they receive all of this information and all of these different considerations. Also, it helps with adaptability to these stressful environments. So this muscle memory training, it really helps individuals adapt to the physiological and the psychological stressors associated with an active assailant situation. So training in realistic scenarios combined with that muscle memory development, it really prepares individuals to function effectively, even when faced with this level of fear and anxiety that they're faced with in these active assailant situations. So this type of training, it's known as stress inoculation, right? So exposure to realistic scenarios, it really helps individuals by building this stress inoculation. It helps them acclimate to the stressors and dynamics of an actual active assailant incident. So that way, maybe their blinders were here. Well, after training, they're definitely a little bit wider in these situations. So also what seems to happen as you go through this training, or you see these individuals transform through training, and then afterwards, is it creates this increase in situational awareness, aiding in that whole see something, say something. So now these individuals that again walk through life with these blinders on, not even realizing it, they're just a little bit more aware of their environments, their surroundings in these situations. So maybe you're in a shopping mall and now you're paying attention to all of your exits as you go throughout this shopping experience, right? So if you had to recall some of those exits, you can go ahead and take advantage of those opportunities. Or additionally, maybe some places to hide. You know, what are some places ideally that I could take cover in these situations? And so again, you're just creating this heightened level of awareness in these individuals. And so again, that kind of aids in that empowerment. So as you go through this type of training, discuss all types of challenges, whether inside or outside of the four walls of your organization. So yes, as you do this, it's important for them to know all of their response options while they're at work, to include all exits, maybe ideal places to hide if the assailant is between them and their exit. And then what does fight really look like? We say fight, but what does that really truly look like? And what are their options, right? What could aid in that fight? So, so at work, whether it's your work is maybe in a skyrise, or it's a building where all the interior walls are glass, or maybe you have open courtyards, the reality is they could be out in the parking lot, maybe coming to or from work, or at a mall or a bank downtown, or even an outdoor venue. So really what you want to do is you want to consider all the possibilities, so that way they're trained to handle all types of situations that they might face. So for these reasons and so much more, that's why it's so important to kind of dissect this run, hide, fight, and really run through this scenario-based training, and why training the individual is so important in these situations. So Jake, back to you in this.
Go ahead, Randy.
You know, I want just to add on to what Stacy said there, that this is really, the American Psychological Association puts out a study every year called Stress in America. And for the last several years, violence, including active shooter, active assailant, has been like 3 of the top 5 stressors. During the pandemic, it was their health, and now it's inflation and you know political worldwide uncertainty. But in the still top 5, the violence and active shooter in particular is in the top categories. What's causing stress among the average American, even if they don't know it. So what happens with the training, just like Stacy said, they feel more empowered, but it actually dissolves some of that latent anxiety that they're feeling. And I'm talking about your entire population, because we're having so many of these incidents and they're so publicized in the news on a continual basis. That's part of why they go up to their leaders and say thank you, because they walk away with this. They walked in going, man, this may be scary, or they may not even think it's a big deal. But once they go through the training and then they are empowered, that anxiety kind of melts and they feel empowered. So that I didn't necessarily see that as part of the benefits of training when we first created this, but it's a big one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that we even sometimes like to discuss with our students in our classes, is really unpacking for folks the difference between being trained and untrained, because it really helps individuals recognize that having that mental framework of how to navigate a situation like this even further after the fact facilitates that resiliency and that ability to rebound and that ability to recover from the situation as well. So it's leading up to an event, through the event, and then even after the event, that this is impacting and allowing individuals to have that capability to move on with their lives after the fact. And so we got a question, and this is, I'm going to steer over to you, Dave. As we start talking about the options-based approach, if you could start unpacking that for our folks, and what does that really mean? Because we've seen it historically where sometimes this can kind of become a prescriptive process that folks want to talk through. And so the importance of that options-based approach, and really tailoring that to a question that we have in terms of, when this is such a concerning topic for an organization, doing this in a manner that can really build that confidence in the folks that we're teaching.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Great foundation by my colleagues here. I'm going to go ahead and build upon that a little bit. And so I'll get to the specific question towards the end of this. And if I forget, just virtually smack me and I'll come back to it. But we want to talk about what we talk about at the center as an options-based approach. About a year and a half or so, we all got together and I basically said to the team, I said, not everybody teaches active assailant response as an options-based approach. Sometimes, whether it's well-intended, it becomes this linear progression of, well, you run, then you hide, then you fight. And if we're honest with ourselves, even in the CPPS team, because when I'm going to talk about the fight piece a little bit later, we used to talk about it as a last resort. And I don't think that's useful now to talk about neutralizing or fighting to be a last resort, because we now know from studying hundreds, if not thousands of these cases, sometimes you are thrust upon with that other option right out of the barrel, right off the bat. So we have to be prepared for it. So when we talk about an options-based approach, and I want to thank Stacy for mentioning believe what you see and hear. That's a term I've used for a long time. And what it really means is at the beginning or the potentially start of this cataclysmic or extreme violent event, you need to believe what you see and hear. One of the things we talked about back in the day, and we still talk about it with CPPS, is to figure it out. But don't spend a lot of time figuring it out. But, you know, unless you're used to having shots being fired in your office space or on the Little League diamond or at your local grocery store, believe what you see and hear, and then based upon our training, pick an option. Now, it's not a one and done. As strongly as I believe there is no substitute for being away or not being where the threat is, and those folks that know me, I harp on this a whole lot. If you're there, you're under threat. If you're not where the threat is, you're safe, and that's the idea. Believe what you see and hear and pick an option. Get away if you can. Continue to believe what you see and hear. Be prepared to pick another option. Continue to believe what you see and hear and pick another option. And you only have one job. Your employees, your colleagues only have one job in this scenario, and that's survive the event. Not to be a hero, not to be employee of the month, not to be, the community medal. Those are all nice things, because that means we've done good, positive things in an active assailant response situation. But what we want to be able to do is keep moving, keep thinking, keep situationally aware, as Stacy talked about before, and pick appropriate options. And we have example upon example upon example. Actually, some people that weren't trained at all, this one case, and Randy knows where I'm going with this. We had one, she was the lawyer. She was the head of compliance for like a Fortune 100 company. Well, she started out as a young lawyer right out of law school in San Francisco. And several decades ago, after lunch, an individual came up with a box of flowers to the receptionist. They had little or no security and had a shotgun underneath, broke in and just started injuring people, killing people as they went through. She had no training. So she instinctively went under the desk. And it didn't take her long to realize he was going from room to room, from desk to desk, that was a bad idea. She crawled out on all fours, headed down towards an emergency exit just instinctively. What did she find? She found another colleague frozen in fear. So she grabbed her, put her arm in arm, dragged her along, went into the exit area, the stairwell. Congratulations, she survived, right? Guess where the shooter went? Right where they were. And so she had to go upstairs, had to go across, had to go back downstairs, had to deploy several of these options before they were actually safe. And so it really hammered home to me that with the training, how much better we are. Believe what you see and hear, pick an option. Believe what you see and hear, pick another option. Believe what you see and hear, pick another option until you're through it. Another thing to keep in mind, particularly for our leadership folks, this is not rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, one of my favorite expressions, right? We don't want more people hurt or killed because we don't have everybody trained and we're trying to drag people out and some people are frozen, fight or flight, whatever they're doing. That is why we advocate everybody being trained the same way. And that is also why of the 3 tiers in the an international standard for workplace violence prevention, it came out in 2020, they focused on enterprise-wide active assailant training. Then they focused on campus or building or areas or office specific active assailant training, but by far the most important training will always be training the individual, because you never know when these things are going to happen. If you've got them all in place, it's great, but we can't have our people relying on a plan that they maybe have never seen before, or they're in a building where they've never worked before. But what they do know is they know this options-based approach, and they're prepared, and they've kind of they're mindful, not fearful, as we like to say, and they make much better decisions, and lives are saved because of that. The final piece I'll say about that, and then I'll move on to the question is, I think it was Randy that first used the phrase mental permission slip. By providing training to your people of all three tiers, you're giving them a mental permission slip to make decisions on their own behalf, on their team's behalf, on the community's behalf. And as Randy pointed out, this may very well come in handy when they're at the PTA meeting, or they may be at the ballpark, or they may be at a shopping mall, or they may be in a house of worship. And while we've trained them in this potential office environment, these are transferable skills, and they need to be looked at. Finally, I did come to the question, and that is, what about people that might be fearful? Maybe there's I hear it all the time, we have a culture, we can't say active shooter or active assailant. No one will pay attention to us. People are fearful. People, generally speaking, are fearful what they don't know. So knowledge is power. So we find an empathic way to share that information, and then let them know that these are options, that we're grading on a curve. Nobody's judging you. It doesn't go in your work requirement statement how well you do these things, but it becomes a force multiplier within your organization. You actually have people that are thinking of these things ahead of time, not only to report things. If you see something, say something. But what we're talking about today is, we know, Randy and I were in a training for I think it was probably a Fortune 5 or Fortune 10 company many years ago. And the CEO looked at Randy and said, "I'm confused. I didn't think bad things happen to good people and good organizations." Yes, they do. Yes, they can. Yes, they will. So no matter how good your prevention program is, you have to be able to have a response strategy, and the best response strategy is a consistent one for everybody else. Jake?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Dave. Randy, you got something you'd like to add on?
Well, I just wanted to give an example that, Dave gave it a perfect example of that: believe what you see and hear, and then respond, and then continue to believe what you see and respond. And, I sat in on the FBI debrief of that shooting in Texas, that one I mentioned earlier. And this is a perfect example how it didn't work, because they didn't do that. And the outcome, the reason 26 people were killed is because when the shooter showed up at that church, and from the outside, he started shooting in through the walls into the church, into the sanctuary where people were. And somebody yelled out in the room, said, "Duck, get down." And so everybody did. It was a small little church, about 100 people in there. And they ducked down behind the pews. But then I think he fired somewhere like 250 rounds into the church from the outside. But then he came into the church. Well, but they didn't then change. They stayed ducked behind the pews, and they didn't get out. They didn't change their response because of the changing set of circumstances. And he walked around and killed 26 of them. Okay, so that's how critically important it is to believe what you see and hear and respond. And it's this dynamic situation that people understand it's not just one and done, because in that case, that's the only reason why. They had exits, they had ways of getting out, but they didn't have the understanding. And it turned out to be a real tragic situation.
Yeah, and that's so much of the value of when we talk about responding, that figure out piece of this, that initial, don't just blindly respond, have an informed response as you're going through these options, because like Dave, you were saying, it might have to change as you progress through that response, getting yourself to safety, whatever that looks like. But it's not just blindly running or blindly getting to a place where you can hide or whatever that might be. It's an informed response where you're figuring out what that best action is, that best action that's going to facilitate safety for you as the immediate responder, the individual inside of the circumstance, and continuing that progression until the situation is over, whether that's by law enforcement or you get yourself to that location where you are, in fact, at a safe place, whatever that might be. So It's that informed process. Figuring out, believe what you see in here, cannot be overstated as part of this. But we did get another question that I think is valuable. When we're talking about kind of the holistic process of this, commonly it's not, well, I guess it's not uncommon for us to talk about or do training across the US for the specific subject matter. But when it comes from the other side of this, we need to get leadership involved. We need to get leadership on board with rolling this training out. Randy, I think this would be a great question for you in terms of how do we get leadership on board, and what kind of at a high level, the holistic process of this, not just this kind of training piece that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, several years ago, I met with the CEO of one of Warren Buffett's companies, and he had some of this latent anxiety for his people because he had just gone and had an incident with a outrageous driver and yelling and screaming, and he just came back and said, the world's going bad. It's going to hell in a handbasket, and he was concerned for his employees, but he didn't understand what was available. So part of getting the leaders' buy-in is to understand that framework, not just how you do active shooter training. That's just an isolated component. But when I find that the entire programmatics are explained to the leaders, whether it's from inside the company or somebody on the outside, they understand it and it makes sense. And so that when we talk about the ASIS international standard, where it goes from policy to awareness training to all the levels to include the leadership of the organization, the C-suite and the board of directors, and they understand how it all fits together, normally that's enough for them to go, this makes sense. In fact, the gentleman that I visited with said, if I knew this existed and I didn't do anything about it, and an incident happened, I couldn't live with myself. So there's just kind of the moral and emotional responsibility that most leaders have. The second component is that unlike several years ago, I was involved in a court case down in San Diego. There was an active shooter and a subsequent litigation, and I came in and was on the, being deposed for one of the families. And the outcome of that, there was no program in place, and the liability was, clearly on the company. And the settlement was around $5 million. Well, what's happening now is because these incidents are happening so frequently, getting so much publicity, that I think when you go to see these cases being tried in a jury case, people don't know what to do, but they see that there was clearly negligence on the organization at this stage in the game for not having a program in place and not implementing it and tracking it and making it holistic. That the settlements and the jury awards are not in the $5-10 million. They're going 50 million, 100 million, in some cases over $1 billion, surrounding this issue of extreme violence in the workplace. So most organizations, when you get into those kind of numbers, that may not be the driving force of a leader's decision and getting buy-in. That's usually more on the just understanding how it works and the benefits of it. But there is the stick. And that stick is that if you don't have a program and you have an incident, and then in comes either OSHA to do the governmental fines of $50,000, $100,000, but the real financial hit comes in the civil litigation following that. And it's just in the last couple of years that we've seen that really change and grow more very dramatically. So those are a couple of ways of doing that. But what I find is the best way is for them to have, it doesn't take a long time, maybe 15-20 minutes. You can give the leaders of an organization an understanding of how this whole process works, why it's important, and what the benefits are. Usually that's enough once they understand it's not just active shooter training, or it's not just a tabletop exercise. It's the holistic package, and that works well.
Awesome. Thank you, Randy. And so it's kind of staying on this theme, we look at this from a whole programmatic perspective. One of the questions we commonly get as well is, what does that progression look like for continuing to expand individual understanding and the advancement and the maturity of preparedness holistically? And one of the concepts we've really been starting to unravel and discuss more with clients is the concept of the slow walk. And so, Dave, I'd like to kind of pass this back over to you and talk about what is that slow walk and how is this valuable as kind of holistic active assailant preparedness and maturity?
Yeah, absolutely, Jake. But I'm going to take the liberty of going backwards a little bit, because the genesis of the slow walk, when I introduced it to you all at CPPS, and you all have been kind enough to embrace it, had to do with individual that have been trained by us. And so what we started to do was, at the end of the day, we would go, because we would have people come from all over the country or all over the region to get training. Sometimes it just wasn't within a brick and mortar organization. And I'd walk up to a student and I'd say, explain your workplace. Well, I'm in a cubicle. I have the closest exit door is about 90, 100 feet away. Or I'm right by an elevator bank, or maybe I have an office, or maybe I just am in a location where I'm at a bullpen and we're just all in there kind of together. These are important questions, because what we used to encourage them, and we still do, is to go back to their place of business operations and look around and determine, before they ever have a need for it, what options might be available to them. So, and you might say, well, that could be depressing. What if I've only got 2 of the 4 options you talked about, Dave? It's not depressing. Knowledge is power, and they now don't have to waste a lot of time if they have an actual event at that location with the hamster wheel spinning. What are my options? What am I going to do? As Stacy was talking about, how I'm going to do that, they know kind of what the limitations are. And what I've seen over and over again, when people go back into their individual space, they generate conversations and they're more informed on what to look for. Now, let's come back now to the slow walk. The slow walk is a same concept, but it's to go back to your campus. It's to go back to your building. It's to go back to your business, entire business unit, and look at potential vulnerabilities and response options in a different way. I know that many of you, because I've done it for a number of years, both in the government and afterwards, we do threat and vulnerability assessments. We do physical security, force protection, whatever you wanted to call them. Those are primarily, how do we keep bad guys out when bad things happen? What we're looking at with the slow walk, we're after this training, and usually after we train leaders, go back to your locations and look from the inside out and see where your vulnerabilities are as it pertains to potential response options or challenges in an active assailant situation. So hopefully that difference is not lost on you all. It's not a physical security assessment with keeping bad things out. How do we survive, and what are our options if we're internal and we have one of these threats? How to evaluate your facilities, recognizing what might work, what might not work. The best example I can give you, I did one of these slow walks with a large manufacturing company, and they had a warehouse, and it had multiple access egress points, as you might imagine. And they went around in the slow walk with a team on their own, and they determined that 3 of the 5 exits were inadequate. One, it was blocked all the time. The second one, there was for fire safety reasons, there was an alarm on it, so there was a delay. You have to be able to factor that in. The third one was the most egregious. You kick out the door, you run outside, and within 6 feet, there's a 20-foot chain link fence with razor wire on it. Those are the types of things that we want to know before we have a potential assailant in the building. And so I also tell our clients, this is not so you can put together a laundry list and request $750,000 in security redundancies. Number one, you're not getting it, right? Number two, it's to learn to play the cards that you're dealt. This is what we've got. This is at headquarters, leadership. This is what we found. If we had to respond to an event tomorrow, here's our challenges, but here's how we can get around that to maximize our response capabilities. So you see then that ties into that. If it's a hotel and you have a lobby that's a choke point, one way in, one way out, there's no way to escape, there's no back room. You can throw up your hands and say, wow, it just, excuse the expression, it sucks to be us. Or you can go, this is a problem. Here's an opportunity for us to come up with some mitigating strategies to be able to work with that. So you learn to play the cards that you're dealt, and then to pass it up through the organization. And sure, there might be some security improvements. Absolutely. But that isn't the point. Recognizing that maybe hide isn't a great option in your facility. It's very limited. And why is that? Perhaps because there's open space and spreading out, which, by the way, we teach, but Run, Hide, Fight does not. Spreading out in situations when you don't have any alternatives. By doing this in advance, muscle memory, as Stacy so aptly put in there, people are empowered to make some decisions on their own behalf, and we're much more likely to have a more satisfactory response from a safety and security standpoint when we do that. So that's the slow walk concept, to encourage your folks to go back, your leaders. If it's a grocery store, go back to your facility. If it's a warehouse, if it's a high rise, go back and see where those vulnerabilities are and what you might need to do to mitigate a threat when it came in. So that's the slow walk concept.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, and it's very powerful. I mean, just that recognition of, you walk outside of your building and there's a fence immediately staring you right in the face. Those are very important things to recognize when we have the time to recognize them, not in the middle of an event. I want to kind of go more broad scale, and then we can kind of bring it into the Q&A aspect of this for folks. We've got a couple that we have to address still. But when we start talking about building a holistic program, we've talked a lot about the training aspect, which is really key to this. But when we start looking at building protocols and building policy and all of these different things, I'll start with Stacy. What are some tips that y'all would recommend for an organization getting started or looking to advance their current program? What are some tips that you would recommend, or a tip that you would recommend for folks on their journey?
Yeah, the one key piece that I would recommend is exercising the protocol, exercising that policy. So you might have put the time in and you might have this beautiful active assailant protocol in place, but if it's not practiced and it's not rehearsed, you might not identify potential issues or gaps. So it really allows for your crisis management team, one, to train as a team, and individuals as well to identify their options, but it also allows for potential issues to kind of come to the forefront here. And so that way it can be addressed, and it really highlights some things that maybe were missed, or some things that weren't thought through, or even some challenges within your organization, like we mentioned. So, I mean, if it's all glass, you know, in your entire building is glass walls, what does that look like? What are your options? Or when I was just doing this training last week, we all saw this ladder inside going up to the roof, and so we're like, this is great, this is a great option, until one person in this training of about 50 to 60 individuals said, no, it's a dead end, it's locked, and only I have the key. Well, it's great because he's there with us, but we didn't know that. And these individuals that work in this building every single day had no idea. And so that, to Dave's point, doing that slow walk and identifying these potential risks or these potential challenges, and educating individuals on what those are, and kind of walking everybody through that and all of their different options, really dissects this whole run, hide, fight for your potential situation, but also for potential situations that individuals might face in their day-to-day, you know, whether they're at school or they're in the grocery store or whatever it looks like. It allows them to run through those different options and recall some of that information. So I would definitely say exercising the protocol, and of course, training to it. So yes, thank you, Jake.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Stacy said. It is perfectly appropriate. As a matter of fact, in my professional opinion, it is preferable to break down these training and exercises into manageable small chunks. I have seen many clients that try to go to a full-blown, hey, let's play with the cops. Hey, let's bring first responders in. Hey, we'll have hazmat people come in, and it collapses under its own weight. You need to start simply. Within the business unit, within a building, within the concept, you can continue to build on that, periodic scenarios, progressive scenarios. So maybe you finally do, the goal should be everybody plays. Jake and I, you and I participated in one of the most memorable ones for us when we literally, in the District of Columbia, we had a quasi-government organization that we were working with, and everybody played. The police, the fire department, everybody in the building, internal security, but we didn't start there. So you're much better off breaking it into small chunks. That old adage, "How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time," really does work. But just be consistent and build upon that. I think that's a realistic way, and that sometimes organizations get past this being so daunted. We're never going to have the resources to be able to do that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And just to kind of take that a little bit further at a high level too, for some folks that may or may not be familiar with CPPS, to get to this level, to start doing these things, you really got to have also a prevention process and program in place as well. All of this is part of the same thing. So it really starts with building that foundation, the policies and the procedures, training your individuals at an awareness level, taking that deeper dive with managers and supervisors and giving that information. Because if you start off with an exercise, well, one of the biggest things we do with an exercise is try to identify where our gaps and improvement areas are. Well, if you already know you don't have a program in place, you're only going to find out what you already know, and that's that you need to put some things in place. So you're absolutely right, Dave. It's part of that maturity model. We need to get some things in place before we get that far. But I also want to pass it over to Randy. Randy, what would your biggest tip be for folks going down this journey?
Well, I think the two tips, and you just mentioned one of them, Jake, and that is understand the whole package. Really the focus of a holistic program is on prevention. There is a component to the active shooter, both on training people for active shooter, and then also the tabletop exercise, and that's a critical component. That's why I spent all this time talking about it. But the prevention really is the key. And so from those policies to the different levels of training, all the way up to the senior leadership, understanding that whole package. The second one on exercising, I went to, there was an incident at an outlet mall, a bad shooting here a couple of months ago, down in Texas. And one of our clients asked me to come in after the fact and work with the team because the shooting happened right outside their store. And during the incident, this would be highlighted in a kind of an exercise, what you're talking about. The response they had, the shooting was going on right outside their glass windows. So they were able to lock the door, but then all the customers and their employees went back into their storage room. And one of the dynamics that happened while they were there was, the back door, they could take you out into the parking area. The shooting's going outside the front, but then the shooting's so loud, they couldn't even tell if it was inside the store, outside the store, or even right behind them. They're very disoriented. And so, but one of the dynamics they had was, and I don't think they even thought about this, is they had people that were the customers that were saying, we want to go out the back door. And the employees are saying, no, we don't want to open the door. And they're saying, no, you need to let me out the door. So they had to make this decision because now they're trying to, they got 60, 70 people in the back storage room that's made for about 10, and they're all crowded together. And so they did wind up opening the door. And then I think it happened again. And they said, this is the last time we're going to open the door. And because this was their lockdown spot. But that was a dynamic they hadn't even thought about or considered, is what do we do if different people have different opinions on, our secure area? It was really kind of a quasi-secure area. But the other component that happened, and it wound up changing the entire policy for the entire company, is one of the things they had their employees do is when they came in, they each had a little storage locker, and they weren't allowed to carry their cell phone with them and while they're working. And so they had to put the employee had to put their cell phones in the storage bin. And well, when this incident happened, one of the employees took off and ran. And he did run out the back, and he just kept running until he was about a mile away from the outlet center. And then, of course, when these incidents are happening, everything goes into lockdown. It took the police, 3 or 4 hours to release the people in the back. And then they're trying to identify who's where. Well, they didn't know where this one employee was. There are dead individuals outside in the parking area outside their store. And they can't get a hold of this guy because he didn't have a cell phone. And he didn't think to call back into the manager. So they spent 6-8 hours thinking that he might have been one of the persons that was, taken out. And so subsequently they said, well, we're changing our entire policy because they weren't able to. Finally, he called one of the supervisors and they identified that he was alive. But this global retailer, changed their whole policy because of what came out during this active shooter incident. So those are kind of things that they could think through, through some of those exercises that they might not have had they not gone through that. So we saw that happen, live just a couple of months ago.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that, Randy, and great tips. And, as part of this, we're kind of phasing into the next piece of this time we have together. And so I want to start getting to some of these questions that folks have submitted. And just a reminder for everybody, if you want to talk about some of your context and variables live, submit just a question mark in the Q&A, and I'll bring you on so you can ask your question. But one of the first ones we got, and I'll open this up to everybody, is what partnerships with external resources or organizations could strengthen overall violence prevention efforts? Anybody want to take that one? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'll start it off. And some of this isn't as intuitive as you might think. I mean, because I ask questions when we go around the country or when we do this training virtually. What are your local resources? If the answer is I'm not sure, there's a gap. What's your local resources? Counseling, law enforcement. What is their law enforcement response strategy for an active assailant? How that's different? I trust you, it's different in many different jurisdictions, so it's useful for you to know that as you build your policies. Local hospitals, where your high-level trauma situations. Another one tying into first responders, are you in a jurisdiction where paramedics are authorized to go in right out of the box with police first responders because they've been jointly trained? If they aren't, they're not coming in to provide any care or first aid until that area is no longer hot. These are questions that you want to know. How about a sister property, another industry? We're not giving away the keys to the kingdom in the retail industry if we know maybe what our folks across the mall are doing or down the street, what resources they have, what are some of the experiences that they've experienced, all part of that preparation piece. Reach out and then have outside experts to assist you before, during, and after you have an event like that. So that's kind of to start the discussion off. Kind of the sky is the limit. Who do you need to bring in to assist you, both before you have an event and then post-event?
Awesome. Thank you. Anybody, Randy or Stacy, anything to add to that one?
Well, there are a lot of resources that are online. It's if you're willing to go dig for them, both from Department of Homeland Security, FBI, Secret Service, in the areas of threat management and violence prevention policies and content. But one of the things that I found is that organizations right now, one of the biggest gaps, and whether you came to work with us to get help with this or an outside source, that doesn't matter as much as what really is needed is this issue of de-escalation. People are losing their minds around the country. Go to a grocery store, parking spot. There's so much anxiety and stress that people with mental health issues are really struggling. And one of the key things that you can do to find resources for is the area of verbal de-escalation for all your employees, especially if they're managers and supervisors, but for all the employees. We're finding more and more requests for it and more need for it because of just the kind of the current world environment. So if you had to focus in on an area that I see as the biggest gap, it probably is equipping people with good de-escalation skills and finding resources for that. We certainly have them, but there are others out there that you can go through local community and things like that. That's a critical need right now.
Awesome. Thank you. This one's for you, Dave. Going back to when we were talking about the slow walk. Is the slow walk done with everyone in a building or just simply the leadership in the building? Or can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is it's more important that you get it done than who actually does it. As a matter of fact, small 2- and 3-person teams may be representing different business units or different parts of the organization is one of the best practice ways to do that. But you want to have some accountability. You want to have some leadership people available, having rank and file employees as part of that. Again, it's an empowering thing and they're going to have a different perspective. So divide and conquer is probably the best way to do that. And then you come back together and compile and discuss your observations and what can be mitigated and maybe they can't. So I'm a big fan of kind of diversifying in that way, but with some continuity.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one we have on here is kind of in regards to holistic access control and physical security considerations. I can kind of tee it up for us and then I'll open it up. But the question is, one of the layers of security would be implementing badges. But the company believes, must be their company, believes that badges are separate from their culture. How do you get senior leadership on board with understanding that badging is part of overall security? And so how do we get leadership on board with that if that's something that an organization is trying to implement?
I mean, I'll take another stab at it. Basically, access control is designed for you to know who's coming into your building and being able to verify who they are. But another thing that needs to be hand in hand is your culture. Do you have a culture of safety and security? Are people naturally curious? If they don't recognize something, or if it doesn't seem right, are they empowered to walk up or to report the fact there was this individual here, he wasn't escorted? Escorting of visitors, recognizing that everybody comes into a central point, that we have to be able to verify who they are, because all it takes is one of these tragedies, that somebody falls through the cracks or piggybacks through on a electronic security system or whatever, and unauthorized people are there for all of us to become believers. So ahead of time, just encourage that from an empathic kind of, and employ your company code. Hi, welcome to XYZ company. Can I help you? Is somebody with you? Can I direct you in some location? This is the very same things, Jake, that you and I talk in the houses of worship venue. Encourage people. Hey, how are you? I'm Dave. I'm a greeter. What can I do for you? Is there something I can help? But if we're not paying attention, however, we miss those things. So visitors, keeping track of visitors, making sure they're gone at the end of the day, reconciling badges, has a lot more to do with making sure we know who our constituents and our customers are than trying to keep people out. It can appear to be draconian, but it really should work hand in hand. That's kind of my take.
Awesome.
And the only thing I would add to that is, typically the areas that their culture is open and welcoming, and retail environment, for example, I'm not going to put access control going into Walmart, but where organizations can, and they understand that a holistic security program, this is more of an education now for the leadership, that you got physical security, you have information security, you got cyber security, and you got the personnel security, and how they all work together. And it's up to them and the culture whether or not they want to implement it. But as Dave said, you can have the best access control system in the world, and then you have 5 people going in, piggybacking right in, and it kind of defeats the whole thing. So that understanding and buy-in from the leadership to the individual, that they're stakeholders in their own personal security and the organizational resiliency. So if they buy into it, then it works. If they don't, then it's just going to be hard to overcome the pushback. But I do think, and I've seen that leadership buy-in to the whole physical security components, areas that used to not do it, they're buying into it more based on these incidents happening over and over and over. So there's kind of a psychological thing that's going on to where it seems more like due diligence rather than, unless the environment is a church or a house of worship or places where it doesn't work to put access control.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Randy.
Even with those, you could have them there during the week. Where it's, you don't have to have an open environment in your house of worship 7 days a week, other than during those service times. So that's another vulnerability we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So another one we had submitted is, are there legal risks with conducting a facility lockdown of department doors? During an event, should we lock down all facility doors and instruct staff to run, hide, fight? And what they're saying for context is back office departments currently require badge access that could be disabled. So it sounds like that's maybe more of a secure area than other parts of the facility. So thoughts on that?
So you're saying, Jake, is it a liability for a training exercise or in a real event?
Sounds like they're asking for a real event. Are there legal risks with conducting facility lockdown of certain department doors within a facility?
Wow,
Awesome.
I'll give an initial thought on that, but everything's situationally dependent. I can't think of a way we give guidance that says, okay, yes. In fact, remember what I said about earlier, there's very few black and whites and shoulds in these situations because it's so fluid and dynamic. So in your policy, there could be things where you are going to isolate and lock down certain areas, but it's so fluid, you may not even know where the shooter is. And make an access lock in areas where people may want to egress through. There's just so many dynamics that I think it's pretty tough to, and I would also start by saying there's legal vulnerability with anything. So, no matter what you do, you can see the lawsuit, but you want to make sure that, you thought through it. And I understand they're trying to think through it right there, but to give kind of a what if, it's pretty tough to do in the moment as part of the plan.
Mhm.
Dave, you got any other thoughts on that?
No, I agree. The key to all of this is being able to articulate why you did what you did when you did. So we should be thinking about that before we ever have some type of an event, because our policies and obviously our bias is pretty strong here at the center. Get away from the threat as opposed to locking people in. Unless you absolutely know that you can isolate and contain the threat that way, my answer would be probably not consider doing that. It's better to let people make decisions, help them get away from the situation. Randy, one of the things I think that worked for our client in Texas was they had a pretty good idea that the threat was in the main mall and not in their store. So retreating and hiding under those circumstances made a lot more sense. But then, of course, it goes to the next step. Can we get out the back door? Should we get to the back door? But I'm not a big fan of blanketly closing fire doors just because you may have your own people caught or trapped in there. But again, these are all articulatable, and you have to be able to test these scenarios and see what works. So, the short answer for me, Randy, would be if you know where the threat is, perhaps that makes sense. But if you're not sure, that's probably not your best option.
And so many times it's hard in the moment to know where he is.
Exactly.
And that's also part of going back to the value of training. If doors are locked as a standard and approaching the door from one direction, we know it's going to be locked, but the other direction, we know it's going to facilitate an exit. Those are good, valuable things to talk about with our folks during that training session, so they can at least understand what they're working with should something occur.
I'm sorry, Jake. I think the one caveat, and I'll use the houses of worship as an example. I always advocate for larger churches. When you're not using portions of the building, close it, lock it down. So you got a good, reasonable expectation that nobody's going to go in there. Sometimes that may work on your campus, but you better be darn sure that you don't have the night watchman or the janitor or somebody working late or that might have slipped in there. So,
yeah. So one more on here. We often get asked in trainings about the best way to notify the building that there is an active assailant. Our buildings do not have public address systems, and some folks instinctively want to pull the fire alarm. We mentioned the potential pros and cons of that strategy, but have you seen a better option, particularly for multi-story office spaces? Open that up to the floor. So it sounds like the question's primarily regarding, well, first of all, for the fire alarm issue, that's kind of an easy part of this. We recommend that we don't want to do that for this kind of a circumstance, given the natural protocol for responding to fire is the evacuation piece. Well, if we do that, we could potentially lead our folks right into the threat. And actually, we've even seen some of these cases that you probably recognize in the news if you've read some of the stories, is that's become a tactic for some of these incidents that have occurred to actually draw people out. So we definitely want to talk about that with our folks. But it seems like the question, if I'm understanding correctly, is how do we notify our folks that there's an event going on? Best practices for that.
There are a lot of systems out there now, particularly post Virginia Tech, that are ways of notifying people via all sources. Whether it's, if you don't have a public announcement system, then text messages coming up on your computer, flashing lights. There could be a variety of ways. One of the things, though, that I'm not a big fan of, normally, is code words. Code gray or code silver. If people don't know what exactly that means or they haven't been trained. And so what I see mostly in the mass notification systems is, like you said, active shooter on campus, implement training, run, hide, fight, get out, hide out, take out, something like that. You're not telling them what to do. You're not telling them where the shooter is unless you really know. And it's really hard to get specific guidance saying everybody lock down. It's that options based, and they got to know what all those options are. And you want to make it clear. Sometimes people say, well, we don't want the shooter to know that we know he's in there. Well, he's already in there. So, I mean, I don't think that's much of an issue as letting people know that they need to begin to implement their responses.
Yeah. The other reality is the compliance documents require you have multiple avenues of notification, and Randy articulated some of those. But the reality is the most bang for your buck is personal training and making their own decisions, because the event might well be on its way to being over. By the way, somebody can get to a public address system or one of those, whether it's Everbridge or whatever it is, it's going to be quite late in the process. So I don't think we want, they're helpful, but I don't think we want to rely on those, which is why we talk about the options-based training.
Yeah.
And then also, I think it's important to mention that, and I mentioned it several times throughout, what I was discussing is, let's say you have an active shooter, is the active assailant, but what if they're not an active shooter, right? What if now the scenario is they have a bladed instrument? Does that change your courses of action? Or what if, someone comes into one of the facilities with a bomb, or you're in the parking lot and it now becomes a vehicle? And so again, when you talk about those options-based approach, you're really giving these individuals these options to deal with whatever the situation is that they're facing, right? And so the same goes for, when you're hiding and you're taking cover and concealment, right? So there's a lot of different variations that go into that training aspect as well, because when I'm in these trainings and people are like, okay, you hide, and I'm like, okay, we're in this room, what do we do? And they look at me like, well, I don't know, we just hide like in a cupboard or something, right? And it's like, well, are there other precautions we could take, right? Look at the makeup of this door. Does it open from the inside? Does it open from the outside? What, okay, that's great. Now what do we do? Do we huddle together and all take cover in this side closet or whatever it might be? Or do we spread out? Right? Is someone's Ring doorbell going to go off right when the assailant's walking by? Do we shut off the lights, make it look like nobody's here? There's so many different considerations that go into this type of training. And then what happens if now the assailant's trying to make their way through our barricaded doors? Like, what does that look like? What options do we have to fight? Do we have, like Randy says, that mental permission slip to actually take action in these situations when our life depends on it? So anyway, so it's important too that we don't just get stuck in this, it's an active shooter situation. It could be so many different variations of an active assailant. So it's important to kind of talk through all those different options.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. And just kind of bringing that full circle back for that question to what Dave was saying, as part of a holistic preparedness, having those redundancies built in for the notification process. Can't overstate that, because you might have a facility where if your go-to protocol is for notifying people through an electronic means, email, text message, whatever that might be. What if they walk away from those digital means and they're in the bathroom for whatever purpose, and they don't have their phone right next to them and get that notification? So having something else, a strobe or any kind of means that those redundancies built in is really, really important. Another question we received, please feel free to resubmit the question if I don't read this accurately, but we're a church that is ALICE response trained, that stresses lockdown and wait for information on what to do next. Is that now less important than making evacuation the importance? So it sounds like the question is, are we stressing lockdown or are we stressing evacuation? And I think the short answer is it goes back to the options-based approach, right? Based upon the individual and experience, they respond accordingly. Would y'all want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I would just say that we at the center do not default to a lockdown and wait and see approach. And I think we've articulated that. Nothing against ALICE or anything else. That's very much a traditional law enforcement / school approach. you're much better off to have that as your options as your default thing to do. Anytime, in my professional opinion, anytime we tell people this is your default move, we're asking for problems. So it may end up being your right decision, but it shouldn't be a default move. So that's my 2 cents worth. You still go back to your options-based approach. What's available? What makes the most sense?
Yeah, after the Parkland school shooting, and I knew for years that people were training the schools for lockdown only. And as Dave said, it's a good option in some cases, but to say that is the default and that is the only, we put a video together called Beyond Lockdown for that very reason for the K through 12 schools. And, we could give examples and case studies of where having other options. I mean, just think about Columbine. Your kids are in the library or in the cafeteria and they're being chased around by somebody with a gun. They better have some other options and not wait to be told what to do when somebody's chasing them around the cafeteria with a gun. So, there are many times where lockdown works, and there are many times where you got to have some other options, and that's what we advocate and have since 2007.
Awesome. Looks like we got it right, y'all. He said thank you. So I don't have any other further questions, so I'll just kind of give it a moment for any further ones. But if we don't get it answered now, we can follow up with everybody in an FAQ. Yeah, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I just want to tack on to what Stacy's kind of stream of thought there was. What if it's not an active assailant? What if it starts as an active assailant and turns into a hostage barricade situation? What if it starts as a hostage barricade, turns into an active assailant? We believe at the center that part of your training should include both active assailant response and hostage survival response as part of it, because you never quite know the dynamics, they change. And so I think that's another one to keep in mind, because we've had many cases that started out with a hostage barricade, maybe a domestic violence situation, then turned into an active assailant, or vice versa, or actually go back and forth a few times. So folks need to understand the difference in the response options.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And again, y'all, if you do have questions that you think of after this, submit them or something, and we'll make sure all of those are answered for everybody's edification. But we're also going to be sending out some materials and different things. So I'm actually going to share my screen again for some of these follow-on materials. And Randy, I'll pass it on to you well, one last question, I guess. Can you recommend a good hostage training?
I think we can, but Randy, I'll let you handle that.
That's right.
Yeah, we've been doing hostage survival training since 1993. So about 30 years we've been doing that training. And if that's something that you need to do, we have training both virtual, e-learning, as well as in person, and usually based on the risk level. It makes a difference whether you do it in person or virtual. So yeah, we certainly are happy to help you with that. And the other one thing that I wanted to mention is that one of the questions had to do with getting buy-in from the leaders. We just recently have put together what we call an acquisition support package. It's basically how do you get buy-in from the leadership. And I did a video that's meant for security professionals to be able to take to HR, take to the leaders, talking about in a very brief amount of time why that's needed. So we're happy to be able to provide that for you when we're done. We got some other resources that we're going to provide. And usually when we do these seminars, folks fit into one of two categories. Either they're representing an organization and they're a security professional or HR professional within the organization. Other times they actually are security practitioners that are independent consultants. They have their own consulting work that they do, and maybe they do it on a volunteer or for fee basis. And we have programs that would support both sides of that. On the organizational, we have a program called the Safe Workplace Unlimited Package, which you see right here on the screen right now. You can scan that code, but it's brand new and something that we put together to address holistically the entire program that you need to have. And if you work with us to be able to put that together, it can lead to what we call the Safe Workplace certification. which is an organizational certification saying that you meet the requirements of the national standards and OSHA. But there's a lot more included now in that unlimited package, and so I'd encourage you to take a look at that on that scan. Then the other component that I wanted to mention is the instructor certification. If you have your own practice and you want to have some vetted curriculum and training to be able to take out, we have an online instructor certification courses, both for awareness training and that second level for managers and supervisors. We see a lot of folks from the government going through that and private enterprise. And then also, we're going to be doing another seminar following a follow-up to this. If you haven't heard this already, California recently passed this legislation called SB 553. It was just a couple weeks ago. And it basically requires all organizations that have 10 employees or more operating inside the state of California are required now to have a workplace violence program up and running and implemented by July 1st, 2024. So on January 30th, we're going to do a follow-on webinar talking specifically about that legislation. You say, well, I'm in North Carolina, I don't have concerns about California. Well, if you have 10 employees or you have operations that have 10 employees or more in California, this legislation apparently is going to apply even if you're headquartered in North Carolina. The other thing that we're going to talk about is how we think this is going to be kind of the framework for both in other states, and I believe personally in the next few years you're going to see a federal legislation get passed that's going to address the requirements for workplace violence. And so getting ahead of the curve certainly is not only the right thing to do, but it's going to be compliance here in the not too distant future. But it is right now for California and any organizations that's operating out there. So Jake, I'll turn it back to you to close her down.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending. Hopefully you found some valuable tools to be able to implement within your own programs. We'll send everything out in a next day or so. We're going to clean up this webinar so everybody can have this as a nice file to use, as well as the other materials. So give us a couple days to be able to have our production team be able to turn this into a nice file for everybody. We'll also be sending out any unanswered questions and those sorts of things. So be on the lookout for those in your email. But of course, if for whatever reason it might go to your junk folder, so just kind of keep tabs on that. But if you do, even beyond that, happen to miss it when it comes through, reach out to us and we'll make sure you get these materials afterwards. But otherwise, thank you so much. Save the date, January 30th for that next webinar, that next workshop. And otherwise, take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.